Bienvenidos a todos y todas. Y si necesita una copia del sermón en español, Ricardo puede llevar uno a ustedes. Levante su mano si necesita esto. En el nombre del Padre, del Hijo y del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Sentarse, por favor. Please be seated. Debo preguntar sus oraciones para Padre Miguel y su marido Cari. Cari tiene problemas con su salud y ellos no pueden estar con nosotros hoy. So I ask your prayers today for Miguel and for Karina Yanez Rios. Karina has some health problems and so they can't be with us here today. And Padre Frank is on retreat. Padre Frank está en Guanajuato, en un retiro. So you're stuck with me. The architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, once talked about how he got his start in life. He says he was about 9 years old, and he was walking across a snowy field with a very stern uncle of his who never cracked a smile. When they reached the far end of the field, his uncle stopped him and pointed back at the snow prints, the footprints in the snow. And he said to Frank, "My tracks are straight as an arrow, and they march directly toward their goal. But your tracks meander aimlessly from the fence to the cows to the woods and back again. There is an important lesson in that." And Frank Lloyd Wright said he determined on the spot not to miss the joy in life that his uncle seemed to have missed, and to meander more frequently, and to march directly less often. Jesus' footprints in the snow must have appeared to his disciples as unpredictable, as Frank Lloyd writes. In the first chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, the author wastes no time on nativity narratives. He, Theos, immediately gets into the business of what Jesus is up to. Jesus is in the synagogue speaking with authority, and then after he leaves the synagogue, they go to Simon's house for brunch. But Simon's mother-in-law is down with a fever. Who will cook? Certainly not Peter. St. Mark writes that Jesus, having grasped her hand, raised her up. And the author emphasizes the Greek verb egenein, to raise. Here and in other passages where Jesus grasped a person's hand to effect a healing. And Mark implies that the power by which Jesus heals is the same power which later will see him resurrected from death. The resurrection isn't a future event after death. Resurrection permeates present reality, and we are invited to locate our lives in relation to the resurrection manifested in Jesus. And then it's nightfall, and the Sabbath restrictions are lifted, and all of Capernaum gathers at the door for healing. And then, in the depths of night, Jesus slips away before dawn. Jesus leaves the house for private prayer in a deserted place, and Simon and his companions hunted him down. "Everyone is searching for you." And Jesus answers, "Let's go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there, for that's what I came out to do." This enigmatic rabbi frustrates his disciples by his restlessness, his sudden disappearances, his unwillingness to state with clarity that he is the Messiah. He meanders around the snowy field like Frank Lloyd Wright, ignoring the stern uncle directives of the scribes and Pharisees. What good can come from following such a man? Indeed, what good came to any of the disciples who first followed him? None of them escaped a martyr's death except perhaps young John. None experienced anything in the way of material success or comfort. Yet all of them experienced what Simon's mother-in-law experienced. Simon's mother-in-law probably had a narrow scope of meaning and reward, living as a widow in the home of her son-in-law. She would have taken pride in fulfilling her role, keeping the house and taking care of meals. Illness had robbed her of meaning, and a fever was no small matter in antiquity. House guests arrive, an up-and-coming rabbi, and she is sidelined. She has lost her place in the community. Then Jesus takes her by the hand and raises her up, and she began to serve them. And the Greek word used for her actions is the word deacon. She is restored to purpose and usefulness, and she knows exactly what to do. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by somebody else, these pages must show. That's the opening line of Charles Dickens' book, David Copperfield. To live with some heroism, to live as fully as we might live, to be a participant, to use all we have and offer service and find something useful to do is no small thing. Miracle, from the Latin miraculum, something to be wondered at, was a translation for the Greek word dynamis, found in St. Mark's Gospel. And a dynamis is an act of power. Jesus' acts of dynamic power reveal that God is in the world, restoring people to useful community with moral authenticity and transcendence and meaning. Jesus leaves Capernaum when the acts of power distract from his message that God has come near. The difficulty in the Capernaum scene that we hear today lies in the fact that Jesus faced a life of either being helpful, being a miracle worker and a fixer, or a life of being faithful, of actualizing his particular life in the way God was calling him to live, to meander in just the right way. And so it is for each one of us. The power of the resurrection infuses our world, and God would take our fevered hands and raise us up for purpose and usefulness. Annual meetings, which we will engage in about 30 minutes, are supposed to remind us of this. Jesus' purpose was not to take away the pain of the world, but to proclaim the message of the near presence of God. Have you not known? Have you not heard? No wonder they hunted Jesus down. He spoke the message in a manner that could be heard, and for which we need to train our ears. Two friends were walking through the crowded atrium of an office building in downtown LA. And suddenly one stopped and said, "Listen to the lovely sound of that cricket." But the other man could not hear anything, and he asked his friend how he could possibly hear a cricket in the midst of the noise of the atrium. And the first man, who was a zoologist, had trained himself through the years to listen for the voice of nature. But he didn't try to explain this. Instead, he took a lucky silver dollar out of his pocket and he flipped a coin onto the marble floor, whereby at least a dozen people stopped and looked around. "We hear," said the zoologist, "what we listen for." What Jesus listens for is not the immediate need to be helpful, but for where the message of God's near presence might be heard and the resurrection taken to heart. Until we have found God, we begin at no beginning and we work to no end, said H.G. Wells. Human beings are instinctively worshipful. We will give our lives and our energies to certain causes and pursuits and persons and groups. That is how we make meaning. We will tune ourselves for crickets or for silver dollars. We will worship something. This is as inevitable as the reflex when a doctor taps our knee with a rubber hammer. And so we must learn to tune our ears. That night in Capernaum, after having been so genuinely helpful, Jesus went alone into the wilderness, deciding that his purpose at that juncture was to move beyond Capernaum. He had listened, and he had heard, and so was me, and so was all of us. If we are to hear aright and worship God and become, in Dickens' somewhat awkward words, the hero of our own lives, meandering a bit, but keeping the faith on ordinary days and living in the power of the resurrection. Amen.